All right, let's get started. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the session on qualities of a highly effective architect. My name is Venkat Subramaniam. I want to talk about things we can do better, and some of you may already be architects, some of you may be aspiring architects. You could be a lead developer, you could be a leader in capacity, not necessarily in a role. It really doesn't matter what your role is. But what can we do to improve our teams? What can we do as leaders in organizations? That's what I want to focus on today. But when I mention the word architect, I want you to think about what comes to your mind. If I say architect, you probably think about architects you have had in your own life, that as you were growing up to become a senior developer yourself, who were the architects that you may be reminded of? And I'm hoping what doesn't come to your mind is an architect like the next one, which is the architect from The Matrix. That's a terrible architect. We don't want to be an architect like that. Somebody who is a macho, who thinks that they know everything and they can do everything. But I think we can be a better architect. But this reminds me of an experience I would probably never forget. I was in a conference years ago, and I was asked to be part of a Birds of Feather session. And it turns out I organized the Birds of Feather session with a good friend of mine, Glenn Vanderberg. And Glenn at the time was a chief architect in a company. And so I was standing next to Glenn, and one of the attendees at the session asked the question, who is an architect and what is their role? And without thinking, I immediately blurted out saying, oh, I really hate architects. And as soon as I said I really hate architects is when I remembered my good friend Glenn Vanderberg is a chief architect in a company. So I took several steps away from him in case he decided to throw a punch on me. And he looked at me and said, so you hate architects, huh? And then he introduced himself as a chief architect, and he said, I also hate architects. That was to my relief. But he went on to explain why he hates architects, and he referred to this article I often mention quite a number of times. It's an article called Who Needs an Architect by Martin Fowler, and this particular article is something I encourage people to read and reread. I've read many, many times, but I would encourage you to take a look at it. I won't spoil the thrill for you to read it. It's a short article about 3.5 pages long. But one of the things he talks about in the article is, what do you expect from a good architect, and what are the characteristics, traits you would expect from an architect? And of course, you can learn a little bit about architecture as well in this particular article. But in this talk, I want to talk about what I would like to call as 12 qualities of a highly effective architect. I'm going to count down from 12 all the way to 1. And these are things that I've learned over the years, things I've observed working with teams, things I've seen in practice, good things and bad things. And I always say that life is full of experiences. Every day we get to learn, and sometimes we get to learn what are good things to do. Sometimes we also get to learn what are the things we want to avoid doing as well. So everybody is a teacher. They teach us everything all the time. Sometimes it's what to do. Sometimes it's what not to do. So I want to talk about a few things that we can take and apply on our own projects. Some of these may be very familiar to you. That's great. Some of them may be new to you. But whether it's familiar or not, I'm hoping you'll be able to take those ideas back and influence your own team and the world around you. So the first one I want to talk about is be a mentor, not a tormentor. And it is very easy for us to sometimes forget where we came from. Every one of us, every single one of us started our career knowing absolutely nothing. And sometimes we come to a point where things are easy, we make decisions, we talk to teams, and slightly ever so we forget where we came from. And then we see people who are not quite as fast as we are in making decisions. Maybe they're not as competent as we are just yet. Maybe they are not really thinking the way we are thinking. But one thing we need to remind ourselves at that point is to have that patience, to be the mentor, not the tormentor to them. And that is something we can really do to help ourselves. So one of the key things to consider is nurturing the team is every one of us as professional responsibility. So it's not your responsibility to architect, to develop product alone. It is your responsibility as a professional to take care of your team as well and to grow them along the way. That becomes very necessary. So be a mentor and think about your team along the way. Now, I'm of the firm belief that knowledge is the wealth, only wealth that grows when given. Now, if I give you $10, I'm going to be poorer by $10. But if I share with you what I know, not only do I help you to learn something maybe you did not know, but along the way, I learn as well. I can't tell you how many times this happens. I start explaining something, and the person in front of me beautifully has that face with a big question mark on it. It's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, oh, so that means I'm not explaining really well. And then I realize I don't know it as well as I thought I really know. So which really helps me to go dig a little deeper into the ideas, to learn a little bit more as well. And so as a result, I become more knowledgeable along the way as the person that I'm interacting with as well. So knowledge is the only wealth I know that you can give and become rich along the way as well. So that's very important to be able to do it. So nurture the team and bring them along. This reminds me of one experience I would probably never forget. I'm a consultant, so I go around the world. I work with different teams, and for a short duration, I would spend my time with the team. I call myself the team enabler. I work with the team to raise the bar, and then of course I leave after that when they are, self-sufficient to what they wanted to achieve. But in one of those, project consulting operations, I went back after a few weeks to a team, and one of the team members said, "Oh, when you were gone, I had quite a number of questions. I wrote them down, and I've been waiting for you to come back to ask you those questions." So I sat down with the developer, went through the questions, answered them, and in the end I said, "I got a question for you. Every one of the questions you wrote down, I'm thankful you wrote them down, very methodical. We went over them, but your architect is more knowledgeable than I am. And your architect obviously has more hands-on experience about the product than I do. And I'm just curious, why did you gather these questions and wait for me to show up to answer your questions? You could have asked that question readily to your architect." And the developer looked very surprised and said, "You mean I will ask my architect these questions?" And I said, "Yes." And the developer said, "Maybe I wouldn't ask the questions to my architect because almost every question we ask, the architect's answer would start with, 'Are you stupid?' So we don't talk to our architect." Well, that is quite sad when you have somebody who is really knowledgeable on a team, but not really as interested in helping the team members really grow. So it's really important for us to take the time to grow the members. So we talked about the role of an architect to be a mentor and to grow the team and to nurture it is extremely important. The next thing also comes from my experience, and sometimes again we forget this. And it's important to criticize ideas, but not people. If you ever sit down to talk about technology to me, I'll be the worst guy around you because I'll endlessly be debating about the technology and the merits of do's and don'ts. But I also know what it is to be on the other side when you feel insulted or when you feel really being talked down to. And there's a really fine line between the two. So make sure that you argue about technologies and ideas, but don't cross over to start criticizing the person behind those ideas. So we want to criticize the ideas, but not the people behind those ideas. This reminds me of an experience, decades ago. I was a very junior developer, and I was excited about design, so I was planning on a particular idea in the design, and as I was designing this particular code, my supervisor showed up and said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I've got a design and I'm working on it." And he said, "Explain it to me." And I started explaining the design. And halfway through the design, he cut me short and said, "If that's your bright idea, I feel really sorry for you." And then he took over to explain how the design should really be done. And I really got offended because I was cut off from the idea. There was no merit to the discussion over here. So I sat down, quietly listened for him for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and he was going on explaining how the design beautifully can be done until he got to the point where I got stuck the day before, and he was like, and he was kind of stuck. And now I said, if that's your bright idea, now I feel really sorry for you. And of course, he got really ticked off, being a supervisor, kicked the wall, screamed for a few minutes, and then settled down, and I said, that didn't go really well, did it, between you and me? I think we can do better by communicating on ideas rather than throwing stones at each other. We became really good friends after that, actually. And that is something we tend to forget quite a bit, is to separate the idea from the person behind it. This reminds me, maybe just before the pandemic, I was teaching a course in Norway, and there was a room full of people. I had really amazing developers in the room, but there was one young developer, maybe 25, 30 years old, and was sitting and listening to my talk, and I was giving a session on design, and he used a term which I did not know, honestly, and I immediately stopped and said, oh my gosh, I don't know what the term is, can you explain it to me? And immediately he said, wait a second, you don't know this term in software design, and you call yourself an instructor, and you dare to stand in front of me and teach the course. And I said, I'm not required to know everything, I'm just a human. I may know a few things that you don't know, and you know certainly a lot of things I don't know. I'm perfectly happy not knowing things, but the question is, can you explain to me what that is? And about 10 minutes goes by, literally, and I use a word, and he could have been quiet, but his instinctive is, oh my gosh, what's that term? And I said, oh my gosh, you don't know that term, and you deserve to be a software engineer being paid to do your work? What a shame on you. And everyone in the room laughed at it and said, see, that didn't really go well, isn't it? There are going to be things you don't know, and you don't know, and I don't know. It's perfectly okay, we can learn from each other. And that is really important to keep in mind, is we always need to separate the ideas from the people. And one of the things I try to do, I'm not perfect at all, but I try to really learn from this experience. And always I think about using the word we instead of using the word you. So when we are talking about design, if I say, hey, let's talk about the design you have created, I'm putting you on the spot right now. Instead, if I say, hey, let's talk about the design we are creating, I am removing the burden from you. It's not about you at this point, it's about the design, it's about the team and how we can create a better design. That's our focus. So keep the focus on the ideas, not on the people. But keep in mind that architecting is really evaluating trade-offs. So you're constantly evaluating trade-offs. When it comes to architecture, you're not picking a solution. You're always picking the compromises between solutions and asking the question, well, this is how this is bending, this is how that's bending. What can I do to compromise so I can be within the range of multiple things? So you may have a really good idea, I may have a really good idea, but in the end, both of them really suck. And we need to really find what is a compromise, the middle ground that really works for us, and we need to really take the time to find it. So one way to do this is to use a technique called debating with knives. So debating with knives is, imagine you want to make a decision between, should we use one framework or another? Or which JavaScript framework should we use? Or which library should we use? All these discussions we often end up having. So you can imagine sitting around a dinner table, and you have somebody who has a knife facing away from them, and the next person has the knife facing towards them. You just put the knife in alternate position, away and towards. And the idea is, when you start debating, the person who has the knife facing away from them talks against using a framework. And the person who has the knife facing towards them speak in favor of using the framework. You go on this for a few minutes, and when things kind of settle down, you flip the knife, and everybody flips the knife. And now the person who spoke against using a framework now needs to speak in favor of using the framework, versus the person who was sitting next to you who spoke in favor of using the framework now needs to speak against it. This gives an opportunity for you to speak on both sides of an issue. Sometimes you will come across people who will only speak in favor of something. That is very being, fanatical about it. Sometimes people only speak against it. that's being biased as well, this gives an opportunity for us to realize there are two sides and we have to evaluate the pros and cons. And sometimes the answer is, I don't know enough about to critique it, or sometimes I don't know enough really to find the faults in it. Well, the answer is, well, take the time to learn about it, then let's come back and talk about it. So this is generally a good idea to practice. And so that is the debating with knives can be very helpful. So focus on the ideas, not on the people, and be very polite and gentle to the people. The next thing I want to talk about here is guide and don't dictate. This comes in handy for us a lot of times when you're a senior developer, when you are an architect, when you are very experienced, you may have the desire to tell people how to do things. And when you start dictating and giving prescription to people, there is a very big risk. There are two risks involved in this particular approach. The first is, if you start telling people what to do, you may have developers around you who are really keen on following orders. And I'll tell you from my experience in general, there are two sets of people that scare me the most. Those who cannot follow instructions and those who can only follow instructions. Both are dangerous group of people. Those who cannot follow instructions, you tell them what to do, you come back in 3 hours, and they're still sitting there doing nothing. And you're like, what happened? Oh, I don't know, I didn't understand this. And then the next group is even more dangerous. You tell them what to do, and they do exactly what was told. And that didn't work. And you ask them, why to try something different? Well, because that's what you told me, right? So these two groups are very dangerous. I want the team to be smarter every day. I want to work with a team where I feel like I'm working with intelligent and smart people who are willing to challenge and make decisions every single day. So one of the job as a leader or an architect is to empower the team around us. And if the team doesn't feel empowered, that's really a part of our problem because we're not fostering an environment where the team feels empowered. That is something we need to really work towards. And again, from my experience, to really guide and not to dictate, I was working with a developer who wanted to talk about a particular problem he was solving. We talked about it, and then he asked the question, how would I go about really implementing this? And I told him, I know exactly how to do it, but I won't tell you. And your job is to go off and try it and spend exactly 1 hour, not anymore. At the end of 1 hour, if you don't have an answer, come to me and I'll give you the answer. Well, 30 minutes later, I was walking down the corridor, I saw him walk by, and he said, oh, by the way, thanks for the discussion, and I've already solved the problem. It was only 30 minutes. And I said, oh, cool, can you explain a little bit about how you solved the problem? And he starts explaining the solution, and I told him, I'm so glad I did not give you the answer that I know, because what you found is way better than what I knew. And this is exactly what you want to have the opportunity. You know there is a way, but you never want to assume that's the best way to do things. And if somebody has a better way, you want to capture that, you want to learn that, and you want the team to use that as well. And in this case, of course, it worked out. But the key is time box your efforts. Give them an hour, give them 30 minutes and say, go try it. Feel empowered. And guess what? In 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, they are going to be the leaders in the industry. How could they become the leaders if we don't really help them to turn into leaders by making decisions, by thinking freely as well? So give them the opportunity to learn, time box their effort, and then, of course, assist them when they need the support, and that's generally a great approach to take. So you may actually discover things from that experience that you may otherwise miss out if you really don't practice that. Well, so we talked about a few different approaches so far. We talked about, guiding the team rather than dictating, be a mentor, not a tormentor, and we also talked about criticize ideas and not people. The next thing I'll talk about is to practice collective ownership. And I cannot emphasize this enough because I am very selfish. I want to practice collective ownership because every time I sit and pair with somebody, I learn something I did not know. It could be a shortcut key, it could be a different way of thinking, it could be a library, it could be a framework, it could be just about anything. I always come out smarter than I went in when I pair up. But of course, that could be great for me, but what is good for a company? What is good for a team? That is something we need to really think about. So this is where something called a truck factor really comes in. So what's a truck factor? A truck factor is the number of people on your project that should be run over by a truck for your project to fail. Now, in your project, what is that number usually? Kind of scary, isn't it? Sometimes it's actually one. If one person quits, then the entire project comes down because nobody else can maintain the code. This actually happened on a project, and we would have been happier if this person was killed by a truck. It's something even worse happened. He won a lottery ticket, and he was a millionaire, and he quit, and the rest of the team had to suffer because nobody could maintain the code he had written. So this is something we need to think about. So when you think about a project, in the beginning, you'll go really faster if people are working on their own code. You know, you work on your code, and he works on his code, she works on her code. 6 months later, I'm like, this is great. We are at a maximum efficiency, isn't it? That is like the turkey talking the week before Thanksgiving. You ask the turkey, how are things going? And the turkey says, great. They've been feeding me more recently. Life is really happy, not knowing that Thanksgiving is only a week away. That's the project manager, right? So the project manager is like, this is great. Everything's going really, really fast. And one day he quits the job, and guess what? Nobody else can maintain the code. That is not about him writing the code. That's about anybody writing the code. Because when people write code and nobody else looks at it, what happens? I know of only one way to write readable code, and that is to read it. So if nobody has ever read your code, how could you claim that the code is readable? So this actually happened in a project here somewhere in Europe. I won't mention the name of the country or the company, because if I say one, you will know the other. And I have an NDA, so I cannot say it. But I was in their company. This was a month of March, cold and dark outside, sitting in a room. On one side is the project manager. On the other side is two programmers, kind of sitting like where you both are. And I'm looking at the manager and looking at the programmer. And the manager is like, I am on a very critical project. I need both of you, or at least one of you. Can you come and work on my project, at least part-time? And the two programmers are kind of like you, sitting there with their hands closed, like, no, we will not work on it. So I'm looking at them back and forth. He's pleading, I need help. And the programmer's like, no, we won't work for you. By the way, this company has 70,000 people working for them. And these two programmers sitting there, no, we won't do it. At some point, I broke in. And I said, excuse me, can I ask you, what do you do? And one of the guys very proudly said, oh, both of us work on the same project. And I work on half the code base, and he works on the other half of the code base. I never touch his code, and he never touches my code. And he was so proud about it. And I looked at him, and looked at the other guy, and he was like nodding his head very proudly. That's right, we maintain our territories, right? So they have a territorial ownership. And I looked at this guy and said, but I'm really sorry, but God forbid, you walk out today and you get hit by a truck and you die. What happens? And he proudly said, he dies with me. And the point really is, how could you work on a large company where one person doesn't work on the code and the other person can never maintain the code anymore? That is really sad, but that happens in a lot of companies. So we want to really think about collective ownership, because in the long run, collective ownership reduces the risk on projects, and you can actually go faster, you can find defects quicker, write more maintainable code as well. That becomes very critical. So like I said, I know only one way of writing readable code, which is to ask a colleague to read it. So a collective ownership automatically makes that possible, makes that happen, and can be very effective as well. Now, the next thing I want to talk about here is to allow developers to figure it out. Now, you say, wait a minute, isn't this really somewhat similar to a guide, don't dictate? Well, it's similar, but there's more things to really think about. When you're developing software, there is no right and wrong answers a lot of times. The context really matters. What may really be right in one situation may not be really right in another situation. But I'll mention to you one thing I would say that really influenced my thinking over time. I was working on a project for a good friend of mine, Stuart Halloway. You probably know the name. Stuart Halloway is one of the committers behind the Clojure language. So I was consulting for his company for a while. And I was on a project with them. And they've been working on this project for about a month and a half before I joined. And so the day I joined, I was trying to get access to their code base, trying to start implementing a feature. So I'm really new to their project compared to them working on it for a few weeks. And their team comes with an enormous experience already. And I went to Stu that afternoon and I said, well, I'm looking at this design and there's a better way to design this. And he could have looked at me and said, Venkat, we've been doing this for a while. Why don't you shut up and go back and just do your work? But instead, he looked at me and said, so you think there's a better design here? And I said, yep, there's a better design. We should really design it this way, whereas the design is implemented this way. And he looked at me and said, it would be really great if you can do a quick prototype and we can learn from it, and then we can decide if we need to change the design. And I said, oh, I'll be thrilled to create a prototype. And he said, how much time you need for it? Oh, about 15 minutes maybe. And he's like, your clock just started. I'll see you in 15 minutes. And I was absolutely thrilled because rather than rejecting my idea, he said, go try it out. So I run back to my computer, start prototyping. And 5 minutes later, I walked into the room and I said, Stu, I'm done with prototyping. And he said, it's only 5 minutes. That's great. What did you find? I said, I found that I'm stupid. And he said, well, no. Explain to me what you just found out. And I said, well, on surface, the idea that I had looked really smart, and the idea that you took really doesn't look great. But the minute I start prototyping, I started seeing the problems why we shouldn't go this way. And he said, well, I'm really glad you tried it. I really think the idea you had is actually better, but in this context, it doesn't work properly, unfortunately, but maybe we can consider it in other places. So what do you think you want to do? I'm like, I'm going to go get my work done. But the point is, I was super excited now. I was completely aligned with the solution because I fully understand why that is a better solution. And give that opportunity for developers to take the time to figure it out. But one of the key things that's important as an ingredient in there is it should be extremely safe to be honest. If we are not making it safe to be honest, then we erode the trust in the team. This is an extremely important quality. And imagine you are by the water cooler and you say, you know what, yesterday I was talking to James, and he doesn't even know the fundamentals of data structures. I wonder how they hired James into this project. What are you thinking at this point? You're probably not thinking that James is terrible. You're thinking, wait, if this is what Venkat talks about James to me, I wonder what he talks about me to other people. And you're not going to be open and communicative to me from now on, and I eroded your trust. So it's extremely important to be safe, to be honest, and to realize we all are in this together. There are things I know really well, and there are things you know really well, and there are days when my ignorance is going to show up, and there are other days when yours is going to show up. So we need to really work together to improve each other rather than trying to really gossip about each other to other people and to make it a really safe environment. And also, this is a tweet I made back in 2019. I was working on a problem. This was early in the morning, and I was really struggling how to design this. And I stumbled upon an article, and I was like, whoa, this is an approach I never thought about doing. What a brilliant way to do it. And I read through the article, and the author was talking about how great this idea is, how it solves the problem really well. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I never thought of this idea. And I'm like, I know enough by now in my life not to get too excited about ideas. So immediately I jumped over to start writing a prototype. Within 5 minutes, I found all the problems about the idea that the author never mentioned in the blog post, because the author was so super excited about how great the idea is, only talked about what's good, never mentioned about the pitfalls of it. That's when I tweeted this saying, funny how some ideas go from brilliant to stupid within minutes of prototyping. My own earlier, but in this case, the blog post I read about an article, an idea. So my recommendation is the best way to learn about things, don't argue about technology. Don't discuss about technology. Just prototype the damn thing. And the minute you prototype it, you got concrete things to talk about. That's one of the best ways to learn is to really prototype. I wish as an industry we prototype more often than we do. That can be really helpful. But of course, when you do this, time box your efforts. And you don't want to go on this for months on end. Always ask the team, how much time do you need for this? Like Stu did. He said, how much time do you need for it? Oh, about 15 minutes. Your clock starts right now. Always time box your effort, whether it's a day, whether it's an hour, whether it's a week, and come back and review what you have done and move forward. That can be really an effective way to learn and do. Continuing a little further on that particular idea of prototyping, focus on outcomes, not on process. I was speaking in a conference a few years ago. Little did I know about a particular technology, and about 6 months went by. I got a call from a manager, and he said, why don't you come down and teach our entire team how to apply this technology? It's a random call from a manager. I had no clue. I'm thrilled I'll come and teach. So I was going to go there to the team and teach for a week. So on Monday morning, I knock on the door, and he comes over and says, well, Venkat, we are really happy you are here. The training is going to be on the second floor. But before we go, maybe you want to meet the people who are responsible for you to be here. I said, I didn't know somebody was responsible for me to be here. You called me, so I'm here. And he said, well, I'm the guy who picked up the phone and called, but you're here because of somebody else. Let me show you. And he takes me to a room, a dark room, as typical programmers would sit in, and he opens the door, and I peek in, and there are two guys sitting and pairing in the front of a computer. And he said, these are the two guys who are responsible for you to be here. And I said, I'm surprised, but tell me the backstory. And he said, well, 6 months ago, they heard you speak in a conference about a technology, and they were absolutely blown, they were on fire when they came back, because that technology literally solves all our problems. But what they didn't do is to come and tell us there's a great idea you all should look at. They very quietly got together and spent 2 weeks and wrote a prototype using the technology. They heard about it from your session. And at the end of 2 weeks, they came and showed that to the team and said, here you go, play with it. And they gave us a list of problems the technology solves, which matched exactly with the problems we've been dealing with. And they presented a list of things that are problems in the new technology. Their analysis was thorough and objective, and they gave this to us and said, play with it. If you have questions, we'll answer it. We took a few months to play with it. The team looked at it. We analyzed it end to end. And we are convinced that this is a technology that's going to solve our problems. The team has accepted to move forward. Now the entire team needs to adapt to this. So you are here to train the entire team on how to use this. And I was absolutely surprised at the approach these two people had taken, obviously in developing a prototype. Rather than telling, here's something cool, they actually took the time to prototype and were very thorough and objective. That's an incredibly good way to convince the teams on selecting what to do. So a prototyping beats any arguments. And that is one of the things I've learned over and over and over is when you have an idea, prototype it. Because when you prototype it, you are able to go back and experiment, change it, play with it. And when somebody has a doubt, that's fine. It's good to have doubts because the doubts are the ones that avoid the risk and we falling into trap. But you can take the prototype and see how that handles the risk as well. That can be really, really beneficial. Now, the next thing here is going to be a little bit harder because you're thinking, wait a minute, we already don't have time. We got to do so many things. And now you are telling me, in addition to learning 200,000 frameworks and libraries and languages, I need to learn about the domain. Now, this is extremely important because if you are a lead developer or an architect, if you don't know enough about the domain, it can be really, really dangerous developing a product. I think you will agree with me when I say this. When we talk about extensibility, I have to admit, extensibility is the scariest thing for me because extensibility is a slippery slope. I have seen more code written terribly for the name of extensibility. Think about this for a minute. What is needed for extensibility? If somebody sits there, I'll give you a story about it. I used to work in chemical engineering. I did not even go to chemistry class when I was a student. I didn't like chemistry. But life has its own, miracles, right? My first job was in chemical engineering. I was working with PhDs in chemical engineering. And this is very humbling because one day I went to this guy and said, hey, I'm looking at this chemistry book. It's got your last name on it. Is that your dad? And he said, no, that's me. These are the people who authored algorithms that is used in engineering field. That's the people I was working with. Not only were these people absolutely brilliant, they were the kindest of people I ever knew. Because I'm a programmer. I would go to them and say, hey, while I'm designing it, I want to make this extensible. And they would very politely listen to me and say, Venkat, if you ever do that, you will break the law of physics. I'm like, I'm so glad I asked you the question. Or I would tell them, I want to make this kind of chemicals extensible to be used here. And they would tell me, oh, but we only work with hydrocarbons, and you would never have that situation. I'm so glad I asked. What do I know about hydrocarbons? But if I made that extensible, I would have written code for what will never happen in the nature. So you cannot make code extensible as a programmer. That is called stupidity. You got to apply this in the context of the domain. So what is needed for extensibility is your ability to anticipate. And here is the catch. If you anticipate really well, you got extensibility. If you anticipate really bad, you got complexity. And who wants complexity? And it's even worse because now the code is complex and it's hard to extend for the right thing you want to extend. I think you would agree with me, in every project, there are three kinds of people, right? And you know who they are. So the first kind of people on every project, those who know about software, nothing about the domain. You know people, right? So looks like I'm testing one. So you know these people, right? These are the people who know the software really well, but don't know the domain at all. You're finding that me at this point, right? The second group of people are the people who don't know the domain really well, but know nothing about the software. They wrote Fortran code back in school. They think they know software. The third group of people who know the domain and the software really well. I know what you're thinking. What about the fourth group of people, right? We'll ignore them politely right now. But in these three groups of people, who is the best of these three groups? I would say it's the third one. Because I will tell you by name, those people in every company I worked for in my 30 years. I know their full name. You know why? Because when you're in a meeting, you turn off the light. Those are the people who glow in the dark. Because those people know the domain and the software really well. But most of the industry is made of the other two groups. We got to collaborate in order to make things extensible. If you have a software person making things extensible, that's called complexity. And that leads to horrible code, which is harder to maintain in the future. So you need to really ask the question, is this real in domain? Is it relevant to the application? We need to really ask that question as we think about extensibility. So domain knowledge is highly critical. Well, we want to really learn the domain, but it's also important to be very deliberate about what we do. So we have to take the time not to learn, but to unlearn as well. Now, here is a problem. I've been in the business of training and consulting for 3-4 decades now, but consistently I've learned about one thing. It's extremely easy to learn a library. It's extremely easy to learn a syntax. It's extremely easy to learn about a framework. It is incredibly hard to learn about a paradigm. It is very difficult to learn about a method of writing code. The reason is, part of the effort is not in learning, part of it is in unlearning. Learning is easy, unlearning is really hard. So learning is relatively easy when compared to unlearning, which requires a lot more effort in general. And we have to be very deliberate about it. Unlearning is a very deliberate activity. Now, this really comes down to taking the time to unlearn. So, for example, if you want to practice test-driven development, you don't learn test-driven development. You have to unlearn your practices to be able to learn test-driven development, and that's why it makes it really hard, among a lot of other things. You also want to diversify your knowledge portfolio. If you know one thing, that's great, but that's a high risk because the things you don't know often can hurt you because decisions are made based on everything, not just what you know. So you really want to diversify your knowledge portfolio. So when it comes to knowledge portfolio, you want to know something, but I'll use the words of Thomas Paine. He says, his words are, he says, learn everything about something and learn something about everything. And I think that's a very important advice to keep in mind. Learn everything about something, but learn something about everything. You don't want to be an expert in something, but not have any knowledge about other things. You want to really have a diversified knowledge portfolio. That's very important. The pragmatic programmer said we should learn at least one new language each year. But what I think they said is not just learn a language. If you know Java really well, you cannot learn C# and tick the box saying, I learned another language. That doesn't count. The language you want to learn should make you cry. It should make you kick. It should make you scream. It should make you crawl on the floor and beg for mercy. Then you are learning a different language. You know, I took 3 efforts to learn Haskell. I had no reason to use Haskell, but I was very curious. And the first time I learned Haskell, I was crying. The second time I learned Haskell, because I failed learning it first time, the second time I was kicking and screaming. About the third time, I calmed down and said, please come to me. And eventually I started understanding Haskell, and it was a very rewarding experience. But the key is, what you learn should fundamentally change your thinking. If it doesn't change your thinking, it doesn't change your behavior, it doesn't change your attitude about things you are learning, you're not learning something worthwhile. So when you learn something new, pick something worthy of that learning. Not just an incremental, oh, this is the same as what I did. It's got to be drastically different from what you do. That's very important. But why should we do this? The reason is, I was teaching a course in a company on a technology, and there were 2 people, kind of like where you're sitting next to each other. Those 2 people were about the same age. And at the time, they were older than me. And I think they're still older than me. And those 2 people were amazing in terms of their response. I would do a little coding to show an idea, and the guy on my left side would say, whoa, hang on a second, that's really cool. Can you compare this to? And he would give a list of languages and features to compare. He was like soaking this up. The guy on the right side was like, he would raise the hand and say, why are you doing this to me? I was just fine writing code. My life was beautiful. I get to go home in the evening. Now I got to learn all of this stuff. Why are you torturing me? And it surprised me because both of them have a similar age and similar experience, but one took more time to diversify the knowledge portfolio and was absorbing the concepts very differently than the other person. And that's when I tweeted this, and I said, the amount of time you need to learn something new is inversely proportional to the number of different things you have learned in the past few years. If there is one thing you have learned really well and you're sticking to it, it's going to be really hard to learn newer things. But if you constantly learn different things every single day, then you are going to be a lot easier to learn things as time goes on. The worst thing that you and I have problem with is this thing called comfort zone. And comfort zone is terrible. When you are a new graduate, you don't know a lot of stuff. You are like, give me this, give me that, I'll learn. And 5 years experience is sitting on this chair. And you're like, I have 5 years experience, and sitting on a chair is more stable than standing, isn't it? And 10 years experience, you're laying down flat. And somebody comes to you and says, I got an idea. It's like, don't bother me. I'm in the siesta, and it's very comfortable. The worst thing is when you gain experience, it really makes it harder. It dumbs down your mental muscle. And your mental muscle says, oh, don't bother me. What if you make an idiot of yourself every single day? For 15 minutes, do something very different, and you feel like this beginner. You feel like that novice. You feel like you're just getting out of school, and you're telling yourself, my goodness, I don't know anything here. And listen to it and say, yes, I'm doing the right thing. Because that sharpens your mental muscle, and you're able to continue to learn along the way. It shortens the time you need to learn something new, to learn something different. So learning happens in deltas. We don't learn something new entirely in one day. We constantly keep learning these incrementally, and suddenly look behind and you realize, oh my gosh, I've come this long in what I'm learning. So that happens quite a bit. But also lead by example. The worst kind of leader is the one who tells you what to do but cannot do it themselves. I was in a company where the architect went to everybody and said, you will do unit testing. And guess what? The architect has never done unit testing and doesn't know how to do unit testing. There is no guidance for the team. It's very difficult to really implement things that you don't know. And this is an experience I've learned over time. And I would say architecture committee is where innovation goes to die. When people are really wound up on, hey, we're going to form these teams and dictate what people do, well, that doesn't work really well, unfortunately. I've seen this happen a lot in companies. That is not very helpful. So what you want to do is to promote this idea where teams can work together and learn continuously. That becomes very necessary in general, and you can promote it. So lead by example, and be the people that people can emulate. You know, when I was, had children at my home, when they were young, I would start brushing the teeth, and they would brush the teeth right away in the night because, oh my gosh, dad and mom are brushing the teeth. I should do that too. That's a good practice. They learn by emulating what we do. And a good architect practices what they preach. So a very worst architect simply preaches and doesn't practice what they are supposed to do. That's very critical. Finally, I'll mention two more things. Write code as an architect. And one of the fiercest thing I have is turning into what's called a PowerPoint architect. These are the terrible people in the world, right? So never be a PowerPoint architect, be a practicing architect. A PowerPoint architect can draw pretty pictures and leaves before anything useful gets done. You want to be a practicing architect, not a PowerPoint architect in general. So practice along and write code as well. And keep in mind, every technical decision that you make has an expiration label. So attach to every decision when you need to reevaluate and come back and say, does it still make sense, and reevaluate it as time goes on. And finally, the last recommendation is evolve your architecture. If you're an architect, you get the pressure, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to deliver architecture. Have the courage to say, I will not deliver architecture because I don't understand much about what I'm doing. That is true courage of the reality. And you tell them, you can give them a draft of the architecture, but not the architecture. You got to take the time to evolve this. So mention the percentage of confidence you have in the architecture at any given time. We have 20% confidence right now. We got 50% confidence right now. Why? It's based on what we know so far, right? Then you are being very truthful, and you're being very realistic as well. And the confidence in architecture should increase with the knowledge of the application you are developing. In the beginning, you know really little. How could you be so confident about what you do? As you move along, as you evaluate, you want to improve your confidence along the way. And you can use things like tracer bullet approach to gain that confidence by practicing, so you can, prototype, experiment, play with it, and know if these things are useful. So we talked about 12 practices to improve the architecture. Just to reiterate, be a mentor, not a tormentor. Criticize ideas, not people. Guide, don't dictate. Practice collective ownership. Allow developers to figure it out. Focus on the outcome, not on the process. gain domain expertise, learn to unlearn very deliberately, diversify your knowledge portfolio, lead by example, practice what you preach, and be the guide team so others can learn from your experience as an architect or a lead. Write code, don't be a PowerPoint architect. Evolve the architecture and gain the confidence as you evolve. I sincerely hope this was useful. Thank you so much for coming. That's all I have.